Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, I like speakers. And not just any type of speaker. I like unusual speakers. In fact, I like unusual audio equipment and mostly vintage audio equipment. And today we're going to take a peek at something that, well, checks all those boxes. Manufactured by a company that dates as far back as 1887. Founded in Japan by an individual by the name of Torokuzo Yamaha. Yeah, these guys know sound. In fact, in 1900, they made their very first upright piano. Earlier, they're making reeds for organs. You know, the organs you play, not the ones in your body. And since then, they've made pretty much every instrument known to humankind, and they've done a darn good job doing that, as well as water sports. I mean, boats and motors and jet skis. I mean, they established a motorbike division all the way back in 1955. They make scooters, just in case you like scooters. They've also manufactured snowmobiles. They've been involved in making really anything that has an engine. A collaborator with companies like Ford, the legendary, in my opinion, 1980s Ford Taurus SHO. Yes, a family sedan that could keep up or pass a Fox body Mustang. Now that's kind of cool, I think anyways. So today, the Yamaha NS-18, affectionately known as the ear speaker, and kind of sort of resembling a musical instrument. Now, are you surprised? Go figure. We're going to take a peek at these unique speakers, talk a little bit about their design, how much you expect to pay for a pair of these if you happen to want to go out and find a pair of these. We'll also talk about servicing the Yamaha NS-18. We'll talk most importantly about how they sound and ultimately whether or not you want a pair of these in your vintage audio collection. All that and a whole bunch more right here on the Vintage Vibe. Stick around. I will say the first thing that I loved was the way they looked. They looked elegant and the finish was, well, superb. Interestingly enough, kind of like a musical instrument, manufactured with pride. I didn't even mind the 1960s type grill cloth. I thought they looked neat. And I thought it was cool that there was provisions for banana plugs as well as this adjustment for soft, flat, and clear. I just wanted to kind of play around with it, get to know it, and, you know, play with the positioning of it, knowing that these were open back and being a dipole type speaker. They kind of had me intrigued. And then the manual telling me that I was now in possession of the most revolutionary speakers that aimed at, well, producing instead of reproducing sounds. And then there was the description of the open back and the fact that, well, it could broadcast sound in all different directions, that they were able to handle extreme frequencies that other speakers couldn't because of the diaphragm material, and that they were vibrant, powerful, and that they can literally shake objects in your room. Now, if that doesn't excite you, I don't know what does. So by definition, that means that sound projects forward and the sound out of the back of the speakers is 180 degrees out of phase. In fact, the most simple dipole speaker is an open baffle. And you essentially get the same amount of output from the back of the speaker as you do the front of the speaker. And because those sound waves are really out of phase from each other, then they can cancel out kind of in the middle. Now, you usually see today bipole and dipole type speakers, particularly in theaters, and they're used for effects that can create kind of a different scale of sound and an ambiance. And I think that's what Yamaha was trying to do, essentially. Now the speaker itself, the bass driver, is made out of styrofoam. It's not a traditional pulp and paper type, cone with a foam or a rubber surround where the driver moves in and out. No, it's really a stationary piece of styrofoam with a Alnico magnet, essentially piston that kind of goes into it that vibrates and creates sound. Now, maybe that's what Yamaha meant by we don't reproduce sound, we produce sound. Regardless, really kind of interesting. And in some of the NS series speakers, they actually had kind of a port in that ear speaker, and it almost kind of worked like a transmission line to create deep bass. Now they can create some bass, and we'll talk about how they sound in a moment. Interesting fact, in fact, some bass guitar amps use the Yamaha ear speaker in them. Now, from what I understand, they weren't tremendously successful, and that bass driver would, in some cases, crack the styrofoam. So we don't see that anymore today. Now, they also use a bullet-style tweeter in them, a horn tweeter, and you've kind of got a unique crossover where you can select soft, which kind of, as you would think, kind of rolls off the edges a little bit, and kind of the normal setting, which should be really the most flat, and then a clear setting, which boosts the high frequencies. Now, I found myself kind of using the clear setting, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So I originally positioned the Yamaha speakers about 2 feet away from the wall, and well, as you can see here in the picture, probably about 6 feet or so apart from each other. And I connected those speakers in the first instance to a Macintosh solid-state power amplifier. And they sounded a little dull and lifeless. In fact, the mid-range, well, best way to describe it was, well, like this. Just a little bit fuzzy. Kind of like having a couple drinks after going out with the boys on a Saturday night. And that's not good for speakers. I mean, I really want to enjoy these speakers. I want to like them. I had high hopes for them. And I love open baffle because they usually don't have that same kind of boxy sound to them. They're not as constrained, and they usually have a bigger scale to them. But the NS-18s really weren't doing anything good at all. I thought maybe the game changer would be the crossover selectors at the back to be able to go from soft to normal to clear. Perhaps those would make, well, these speakers more listenable. And although it did bring some brilliance to the speakers, it still really wasn't the game changer at all. So I thought I'd go back to positioning and look in the manual, but Yamaha only recommended one thing, that you were at least 6 inches away from the wall. And in fact, the closer I got to the wall, the worse the speakers sounded. So, enter my last great idea, well, introduce a tube amplifier like this MA230. Now, these were made in 1968, and you know what? That was the time of early solid state and tube amplifiers, and sometimes lower wattage speakers just sound better with tube amps, and that was the case here. The NS-18 went from dull and lifeless to speakers I was kind of starting to enjoy. The bass became much more full, more realistic, tighter. The mid-range went from kind of fuzzy, well, to a little more euphonic. The high frequencies were sweeter and more extended. And you know what? With certain genres, for example, classical, it was a real winner. In fact, if you're a classical fan, I would recommend a pair of ear speakers with a tube amplifier. So, at about $250 to $350 Canadian in 2023, they're not a bad buy. In fact, you can kind of experiment with them, and if you don't quite like them, they're probably pretty easy to sell in the end. And in terms of maintenance, well, this awkward driver arrangement doesn't have a surround, so that's something you don't have to worry about. But for performance sake, you're going to want to consider recapping these because they're definitely going to benefit in terms of sound. And because these are open baffle, the dust is going to make its way into these switches, and they may cause a problem with an intermittent tweeter, so they're going to likely need a cleaning. Now, I got a feeling the higher you go up the food chain in the NS series speakers, the ear speakers, the better they get. Take, for example, these right here. With a larger bass diaphragm and an individual mid-range driver, they probably aren't as well fuzzy. The mid-range is probably more natural sounding, and I would like to try a pair of these. But as for the NS-18s, are they a yay or a nay? Do they deserve a place in your vintage audio collection? Well, you already know my opinion if you like classical. Otherwise, for me, they are a pass, because despite sounding, well, fairly decent with the right amplifier and fiddling around, I had to work too hard to get these to sound half decent. And I think there's far better other choices out there for your hard-earned money. Thanks for joining me on The Vintage Vibe. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. The Vintage Vibe.